Hi, my name is Howard Friedman, and I'm a Distinguished Professor of Psychology here at the University of California in Riverside, and I'm also author of the book, The Longevity Project.
I'm very interested in your findings in this project. But first, I want to talk about the 102-year-old. So tell me about the 102-year-old in this research project.
Well, this study started right around 1920, and a few of the people who were recruited into the study were recruited even a few years before that. And it was started by Dr. Lewis Terman, who was a psychologist at Stanford, and he wanted to find out how bright children turned out as they grew up. So he went looking for bright children throughout California, mostly in the Los Angeles areas and in the San Francisco Bay Area. And one of the children he found was a boy who was just about born around 1911, and he recruited him into the study, tested him, and said, you're a bright child, we're going to follow you. Well, this boy grew up and has thrived throughout his life. He's still alive, and he's now 102 years old. And I just a couple of months ago went up to see him, and he lives in the Bay Area. He's still thriving, and what's really interesting is that he captures many of the characteristics that predicted who was going to stay healthy and live long. So again, these were children who were recruited almost 100 years ago in the 1920s, and they were followed every 5 to 10 years in the 1920s, the 1930s, 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s. There were measurements all those years, and a few of them are still alive, and it's really interesting to see. Now, a lot of studies go and try to talk to centenarians, people who are 100 years old, and they say, what's your secret to long life? And it's kind of nice to see that this man I talked to, he's really nice. He does fit the criteria we found, but that's a bad way to do the research, because who do you compare them to? You really want to know what the 102-year-olds were like 50 years earlier, 60 years earlier, even 20 years earlier. What were they like when they were 80, when they were 60, when they were 40, right? Because you want to know what's going to keep you healthy throughout your life. So studies that just go and look at really, really old people and ask them their secret, they're really flawed, because the people you want to compare them to are gone. You can't ask them any questions, right? We don't do seances in our research, so they're kind of out of the picture. And so a study to really capture what leads to what and what makes people live really long needs to be following people their whole lives. Now, if I started a study following people their whole lives, that wouldn't be so good for me, because I would be long gone before the study ever finished, right? Because it would take 80 years, 90 years. So we had to do something really interesting, which is start with this archival study, this information that already existed. People had already started studying the people way back in the 20s, and we picked it up around 1990, and we've been going for more than 20 years, filling in missing pieces, seeing how long people lived, seeing what they died from, assessing their personality given information in the records, and talking to some of them as well. And so think of what we have here, really an amazing study where we know all kinds of things about these people, from what kind of personality they had when they were children, what kind of family they lived in, how many books were in their home, whether their parents got divorced, whether they got married, whether they stayed married or got divorced, whether they succeeded in their work, whether they went to college, how successful they were in their lives, whether they went to church, all kinds of things, and then how that related to how healthy they stayed, how long they lived.
So let's talk about this 102-year-old as a poster child for this study, and talk about some of the things you found. I'm very interested in the notion of conscientious in a child and what that means. And now that I know about the 102-year-old, I'm really interested in how that plays out.
Okay, well, that's a great question. In fact, the best personality predictor of long life, the best individual characteristic, is what we call conscientiousness. And it's people who are persistent and who are prudent and who plan. Sometimes it's called the 3 Ps, but they're also very well organized, they're dependable, and they strive for things. And you can assess that in children. Someone who's kind of doing their homework and cleaning up their room and tries to be careful about things. Not too much, but the more serious people. Some people assume that the cheerful, happy-go-lucky kids who are going to thrive, but we didn't really find that. It was these more persistent, prudent, focused children who grew up to be more prudent, focused adults. And if they were persistent. Some of the kids weren't so persistent when they were young, but they became more conscientious as they went into adulthood, and that was helpful then too. So it wasn't like it was fixed at childhood. People did change, but generally the more persistent you were, the more you strive for things and were successful, the longer you lived. And this 102-year-old, he totally fit that. He was always very active, always very persistent, always very well organized. And in fact, last time I met with him, I took some of the early scales that were given to him almost 100 years ago, and we went through them, and I said, how would you rate yourself on this, on that? He basically took the same personality test, almost 100 years later, and he's really off the top of the scale on conscientiousness. So it's not proof by itself, the one person, but it's illustrative of what happened for most of the people who tended to thrive and live long. Now, it's not a 100% guarantee, but these are the trends that we found in the data. And he did, and he said, oh, yeah, no question, I'm very prudent, and we went through the whole series of questions. So I never really talked about this before, but this is the longest repeated personality study that's ever been done, because it lasted more than 90 years from the time he was first assessed to the time I assessed him just a few months ago.
In your project, you also looked at some external factors, not just whether a child was but divorce. So how divorce in a child's life. So how'd your poster child do? Your 102-year-old poster child do on the divorce front?
Well, fortunately, he fit perfectly. He really is the poster child, because we found for men, one of the most important things for a long life was getting married and staying married. So people who were both suited for and able to maintain a good marriage, that tended to really be really health protective. And it made them happy too, but they lived significantly longer. Men who got divorced, stayed divorced, they were at higher risk of dying. Men who got divorced, remarried, got divorced, remarried, got divorced, they were really at high risk of early death. For women, it was a little different. The steadily married women who got married and had a good marriage, that was very helpful for them. But a lot of women got divorced, and they had a lot of good friends, and it didn't really matter. They thrived without the men. And we think that's because one of the best predictors of health and long life is having good social ties, having good social networks, having a lot of friends. And women tend to do that. So when a couple splits up, often the man is left without anyone to go to or turn to, certainly not to the same degree. But the women usually have more friends and have kept the family ties going. And so they are able to substitute that and thrive. So for men, certainly if you can get in a good relationship or replace a good relationship with another good one, that tends to be really healthy.
Is our 102-year-old still married?
He's still married. He is married, I think, 72 years, something like that. I met his wife too. She's in her late 90s, and it's just wonderful for us that they illustrate this, because it's very, very rare. But if you look in obituaries, and we do this sometimes in our study, for the really long-lived men, one of the things you usually see is he is survived by his wife. So it's a good kind of thing to keep men healthy. Again, for women, not so important. Women usually like that finding.
And what are some other interesting things, either part of character or part of external circumstances, that you found?
Okay, well, you always hear what you should do is don't stress out, take it easy, don't work too hard, don't stress, retire, move to Florida, play golf. We found that was all wrong. In fact, it was the people who were really involved and stayed active with something. If they work, this 102-year-old still does part-time work. You don't have to actually do formal work. You could be doing volunteer work in your community, in your church or synagogue, or just any kind of thing that keeps you actively involved. But something that both people often say, to get up in the morning and have some purpose, but also to keep your mind involved. But I think most importantly, to keep social ties, because relations with other people keep you on track. When something starts going wrong, either you're not eating right or you're not doing other things, you're having a problem, when there's other people around, they help you get back on track. And we like to talk about pathways to longevity. So what's really important is getting on a path, and one step leads to another. We like to think sometimes some people have bad luck, and it's true, sometimes there's bad luck, like this meteor struck over Russia and some people were injured. But most things are not really so random. We found one of the most interesting findings to me in the Longevity Project is that people who were on the right track often didn't have as many problems. And the people who were unconscientious and went through a lot of relationships. They tended to be people who would bring more bad things. So they didn't finish college, they started drinking, they were victims of crime, they didn't have a good income, they didn't live in good neighborhoods, and they had all kinds of health problems. So it's not, again, 100%. Some people just have bad luck and you shouldn't blame the victim. But in a lot of cases, what happens is you get on the right track, you get with good friends, a good relationship, you're planful, you're dependable, you're doing things for other people, and that turned out to be very important as well, not just being selfish, but working for other people. You tended to thrive and you tended to live longer. And that brought on other good things. And so one good thing led to another.
One of the things I'm curious about is sort of a mix of internal and external, and that's education and the role it plays. Because if with your study going as long as it did, fewer people went on to college. For example, your 102-year-old's age group, going to college was a different kind of adventure than it is now. First of all, how do you correct for it and measure for it? But secondly, what do you find about education?
Well, it's a really interesting question, because it's well known that education is a good predictor of health and longevity, and of course of income. And people think it's totally the education itself that's doing it. But we found, because we have this longitudinal study that goes from decade to decade to decade, that it's more complicated than that, but it's more interesting in some ways. All the participants in this longevity project were very bright. So they all could have gone to college, but they all didn't. And some of them started and some of them failed out, even though they were quite bright. So it's not just that, go to college, it's going to solve all your problems. It's that only certain people could go to college and then succeed in college and thrive afterwards. And we found it's kind of a reciprocal process. It kind of goes one way or the other way. So if you're a more prudent, persistent child, you're more likely to succeed in high school. You're more likely to get into college. When you're in college, you have problems. You have relationship problems. You have a difficult course. But if you're someone who's willing to pick yourself up and get back on track, and take care, reach out for help when you need it, you succeed, you graduate from college, and then you go on to other good things. So only certain people were likely to go to college and succeed, but for those who did, the college made you more conscientious. So both are happening. So one of the best things about going to college is not just you get better educated, get smarter, and you have better career opportunities, but you actually change your personality somewhat, and you change it in a way that makes you succeed in a lot of other things. And so everybody knows there's lower divorce rates and there's higher income and a lot of other good health benefits from college graduates. But it's not just going from college. It's this kind of process where that will reinforce the kinds of things that maybe will be good for you anyway. So some people go to college later, and that's because they're not ready when they're younger and they're more mature, and then it helps them better. So you don't want to always give the same formula to everybody 100%. And some people did fine. They didn't go to college. It wasn't suited for them, and they still thrive because they had other things that kept them on the right track. They had a good relationship, they had a good job that they liked, something that was able to keep them on track. Some people were off track when they were younger. Like, we found that parental divorce, if your parents divorced when you were young, that was a risk factor for your later health, but not for everybody. So if you managed by the time you were in your 20s to get back on track, you maybe had gone to college, you got married yourself, you had a good job, and it didn't really matter that your parents had divorced. The problem was for those people who their parents got divorced when they were children, then they started smoking as teenagers. A lot of the girls did that because of the stress and the family negativity, or they didn't finish school, or they didn't really succeed in their careers because of those things. So it's not fixed for anybody. There were always people who could get on the right path. In fact, in our book, we give little quizzes that people can use to assess where you are on the path. And people can say, okay, I'm going to take a step back and, try this, try that. So we found that people who, for example, who join community organizations, that's helpful. Volunteering is probably helpful. Anything that gets you out and involved with other people.
So one more kind of nexus that I'm not sure I understand. This research goes through the first depression, and you're now in our second depression because of kids graduating from college who are woefully underemployed, et cetera, et cetera. What if anything, in the first depression, was a predictor? What did economics have to do with anything in this?
Well, partly it's kind of interesting that it wasn't random who then faced later stresses. So the people who were more likely to face economic troubles, they were kind of off the right path in the first place. It's really hard to understand in some ways, but we found, for example, the most stressful thing you could experience during the Second World War, which is what these men were participated in, and some of the women too. They were both men and women in the study. Was to be sent to a South Pacific island to fight the Japanese in a very stressful, terrible situation. Well, we could predict who would be sent there based on their childhood personality. So people who were more impulsive when they were children and not conscientious, they were more likely to somehow wind up years later when they were in their 20s to be sent to the most stressful situations. So it's the same kind of thing with the economics, that some people they can capitalize on disadvantages because they have the right social skills and individual inner strength. So a lot of it came down to maturity. But yeah, it's a threat, and it's hard for people, and a lot of students today will probably, if it throws them off the path, that's going to lead to other problems. If they can't get a job and they start drinking, or they start doing drugs, or they start wandering around, that's going to lead to other bad things. And it sounds sensible when you say it this way. Well, of course, if they do all these negative things, that's going to lead to threats to their health. But in fact, we don't usually think about it that way. We usually think about it in terms of, well, just take this list. Don't smoke, don't drink, eat nuts, on and on and on. And you do those things, you're going to live forever. Well, nobody can follow a list like that. The real secret is to develop patterns that naturally help you do all these things. And some people, they don't have to think about, gee, did I exercise today? They just will naturally stay active. That was one of the other things we found. You hear a lot about physical activity and health and longevity. We did confirm that. So the people who were the most active tended to thrive and stay healthy and live long. But it wasn't necessarily going to the gym or running marathons or doing extreme sports. It was anybody who just stayed physically active, and that could be, if you liked, housework, gardening, cooking, walking, hiking, anything that got you up and out of your chair, that really made a big difference, and as long as you kept doing that. So a lot of people, make a big mistake by that. They want to get away from the stress of their work, and they retire and move somewhere, and they kind of sit in front of the TV. Well, you left your old friends, you left your social circles, you left your reason to do something. You don't have any physical activity. Maybe you'll play golf once in a while, but mostly you're kind of sitting around, and you're eating more, right? You're snacking more, and all kinds of bad things happen. So we really have to change the mentality in this country away from, not that everybody has to work till they drop, that's not what I'm saying at all, but you need to have a transition as you get older to find things that will still keep you active doing something, maybe something you like better. It doesn't always have to be paid work, but if you can do that, that's great too. Something creative, something that absorbs you, that'll keep you healthy and it'll keep you active. It'll keep you, stop. The worst is just sitting and doing nothing.
The thing I'm having a little difficulty understanding, I think, is the tension between predictors and fatalism. You talk about pathways. How would you, from your research, characterize that tension and the choices that people have?
You mean that maybe people don't have a choice because they have certain characteristics? Well, I think that there really is a lot of choice. People don't really usually understand it correctly and can learn to, there's a lot you can do. And one of the mistakes people often make is they assume, well, it's in my biology. They say, well, my parents lived long, or my parents died young, or my grandparents, therefore that's how long I'm going to live. Well, genetics plays some role. There's no doubt it's somewhat important. But it's much less than people think. So only about a third of the variation in how long people live is due to your genes. And so that's important, and especially at really old ages, you tend to have more long-lived relatives. But really, there's a lot of variation there. And in fact, if you think about people and or siblings, they die at different ages. And so knowing how long your parents lived is really not a very good indicator of how long you're going to live. some of the people who lived the longest, their parents actually died quite young. So it kind of gives you the capacity to live long in your genetic makeup, but it doesn't really predict very well. It's really how you live your life. And yeah, it's hard when you have some characteristics and you tend to be a certain way. And sometimes you have to make a decision to say, this is not the right environment for me. One of the most important but most difficult is leaving bad friendships. So, you hear the story a lot about someone growing up in the gangs around. It's really easy to join the gang, and you know that's going to be bad for you in so many ways. But some people walk away from it and they say, you know what, I'm joining this other group. I'm moving away, or if I can't move away, I'm going to at least volunteer in this more safe, productive environment. And though, that's something you can just decide and go do one day. I'm not going to do this kind of dangerous, harmful kind of thing. I'm going to join this other group. And that starts it. First, it feels artificial. Well, I don't really belong with these people. That's not me. I left my friends. But, pretty soon you get used to it, and then they bring you into other activities, and then you're on the right path. And that's what we found. Some people went from not such great pathways to really healthy ones, and other people in the Longevity Project, they went the other way. They were doing okay, and then they kind of fell off the path and wandered away, and then other things started accumulating. Bad things started accumulating.
What do you want to do next? What research would you like to do?
Well, we have such a rich data set because we have over 1,500 people studied for over 80 years now. And one thing we're trying to look at is other things about them, maybe how they thought about the afterlife, or what they thought about religion and meaning later in life, how that impacted their health. We're also going to look more at what their cause of death was. So we have done some of this, but we want to see more about who's more likely to die from cancer and heart disease and injury death, and other causes of death as a function of how they live their lives maybe earlier on. We know some things later in life. Certainly smoking causes heart disease and cancer, but what about all these other kinds of psychological and social things? Do they have a role? We think they probably do. And then it gives us clues to where to look in the biology. We also might look at, try to follow up some of the children or even grandchildren of these participants. One interesting thing we're doing already is trying to combine our data with other people's data. So there's a study going on in Hawaii, which is very similar to our study, but about 30 years behind. So the children in my study were studied first in the 1920s, but these other children in Hawaii were studied first in the 1950s. So most of them are still alive, but they're in their 60s now, right? So they can be tested and they're being examined in terms of their blood work and other behaviors. And so we take that study and we take our study and we've been meshing them together. And we have some very interesting research that says, wow, look, here's one piece from here, here's another piece from here, and here's how we can understand how across the lifespan people thrive. And this is why it's really important to have support for science that can keep these archives going, because somebody else can pick up the research later and say, wait a minute, let's go back and look and see. And just in the last 20 or 30 years, there have been a lot more of these longitudinal studies begun and ongoing. So we're going to know a lot more in another 20 or 30 years. But some people, they raise the objection. They say, well, you can't generalize. These were people who were kids in the 20s, and they lived in the Depression, and they went through World War II, and so on. But that's always the case, right? Whenever you start studying a group of people, once you follow them for decades, they're going to be different from someone born today. So that's inherent. The real question is, does it matter? Where does it matter? And in some things it matters, but in most things we find it doesn't matter. And we talked about how conscientiousness is the single best individual characteristic predicting health and longevity. Well, it turns out that came out in a lot of other studies once we started looking for it. So there's overwhelming confirmation that conscientiousness is very important to staying healthy. And it's true in people on Medicare, it's true in people in young adulthood, it's true in children, and it's true in different places in the world. So by now, we just did a meta-analysis, which is a combination of studies, and we found this same kind of finding across thousands and thousands of people worldwide. So we're really confident in the results, and we're not thinking that it's some artifact of having this particular sample.
One final question. Our 102-year-old, is there anything really surprising? I mean, a lot of it was very confirming in the data, but is there anything that you said, huh, what's that about in his case?
That's a really good question. It's really hard to think of things. He fits so well. I guess one of the just most surprising things is that a man would be that old. I mean, it's pretty rare. There's going to be more and more people living to 100 just because there are more and more people living to 70 and 80. So we see our study as not trying to emulate the 102-year-old. I mean, unless there are some unusual medical breakthroughs, most of us are not going to live, past 100. But there's a big difference between those people who thrive into their 60s and 70s and 80s and those people who are ill or die in their 40s and 50s. And that's really where we have the best evidence. It makes a huge difference. So people say, some people say, well, I don't really care how long I'm going to live. When I get old, I'm going to be frail and I'm going to die. But it's not really true. In fact, the people who live longest are usually the healthiest, and they have enjoyable lives. So the thriving, the happiness starts, even at quite a young age. In their 30s and 40s, you start seeing it. And people, I think, when they reach their 50s and 60s, they'll be very happy they were on this path. And it's not something you can just put off and say, I don't really care what's going to happen because who cares what happens when I'm 80. It's nice to be able to have a good life when you're 80.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.